it's really a misconception to some extent, right? We do as much as possible want to always advocate, oh, sustainable, organic, but what exactly is the definition of sustainable and or organic? Sustainability for a large corporation is very different from sustainability to, a small farm, right? And
Yeah.
likewise for organic.
Yeah, I think that's a big one. That's a big one because so you mentioned the word organic, right?
Mm,
Organic produce, it's actually a standard that only applies to things that are grown in soil. So organic farming actually specifically comes from a US standard that refers to soil that has been certified organic, which means that you have to leave it for 2 3 years, not spray anything at all, and there's like a certain checklist that you have to go through. So for new farms, even if you're a soil farm that's come up new, that's something that takes 2 to 3 years or even 4 years to even get an organic certification. Then you have organic methods of farming. Which means, okay, not spraying this, not spraying that, and everything's as natural as it can be. And hydroponic farming, actually, there is an internal standard for what is organic, which means that you use fully organically sourced bionutrients. That comes with a different cost structure, right? But
mm,
generally, what happens with hydroponic farming is that if you are growing it well in a controlled environment, you naturally don't use pesticides, and you don't have to sort of get rid of pests because in a clean room, ideally, that should not happen. So it depends on your view on things like pesticides and things like that. My mother's generation, at least, they believe that having hydroponically grown vegetables will give you rheumatism, because it wasn't grown in the sun, it was grown in these water tubes, and then they were like, oh, it doesn't taste as good, it's not as nutritious. And right now, the truth is, we've been doing this for 10 15 years. You decide what goes into your plants, so you can actually more accurately sort of predict and ensure that you are getting the nutrition that you would like in your vegetables. But there are a lot of
mm,
these misconceptions, right, that need to be
correct.
debunked. They're like, oh yeah, artificial lighting will never give you the same kind of nutrients and magic that the soil and the sun will give you. Um, but then there's also the balance of like, oh yeah, but if it's grown in the sun, there's a lot of pesticides. Then some other aunties and uncles will tell you, I would rather eat the vegetables that the worms and the bugs are also eating, because that proves that it's organic. And then hydroponic produce, because there are no insects, right? So they'll be like, oh, how come the
Mm,
leaves are so nice? It's because they spray something on it, is it? And it's always this, push and pull between having to explain, having to educate, but also trying to please the customer, right? That's always something that comes up. So when you do opt to do this work, dealing directly with customers, that's something you sign up for, lah, right?
mm.
So it's definitely something that's been an interesting journey. But I think the conversation is opening up. There's a mix of fascination, there's a mix of personal concern for the food that you're eating, but also I think so many of us as consumers are shielded from the larger conversations that happen on the level of, okay, how does industrial agriculture change the way that food is being done, right? Like the conversation on pesticides is one that we think about as a consumer, but think about it from the point of view from the farmer, right? There also needs to be a lot of education as to why there are still big crop protection companies who exist, and they exist for a very good reason. It's for the fact that, well, a lot of big farms do need crop protection and do need sort of some kind of pesticides to preserve
Mm.
the amount of food that's being saved, and to sort of create that level of food and nutrition for people, because otherwise it would all go to waste, right? Otherwise it would be ravaged by pests and things like that. So there's a very, very fine balance, and the whole food system is a very, very complex thing. So breaking it down is one thing, creating a certain product for a certain segment is one thing. But also, I think the larger question is, how do we then move together towards something better for society as a whole, right? How do you make
Mm.
that option something mainstream? How do you make that option aspirational and affordable enough for most people to have?
Yeah, that's fantastic. At the end of the day, it's really down to the individual mindset, right? But not everybody will jump onto the bandwagon immediately about understanding what sustainability is or what it is to them, or whether or not they would prefer organic, or are they okay with saying, okay, I'll just wash off whatever pesticides there are with this that soap, right? Again, right now, our mindsets, why we cannot say that, oh, we're gonna go immediately into this, is because we're still thinking about where does the vegetable grow from? It must have the soil, must have water, it must have nutrients, and it must have the sun. This is in the
Mhm.
textbooks from I don't know, God knows when. Okay, but we grew
Yeah.
up. I grew up in that era. And when hydroponics first came out, I was also wondering to myself, you mean you're growing vegetables and plants from pipes and water?
Yeah.
Wait. Aren't we missing sunlight and the soil? How is that not? Oh yeah, you have to add in chemical fertilizers, which are all in liquid format.
And it sounds scary when you say that you're
Yep,
adding in chemicals. You know,
correct,
what you're
exactly.
adding in is nutrients. It's the same thing as fertilizers. Yeah.
Exactly. We talk about alternate proteins, for
Yeah.
example. Once we go down that rabbit hole, you also wonder, okay, so how does Impossible Meats do it, right? Why is
Oh,
it that
yeah.
it's is it soy based? What are all the oils? How come this is cultured? Oh, you mean animal meat is grown in a lab now? How is that
Mm,
being done? So
mm,
all these things, it's somehow or other we have to break those barriers down
yeah.
and open up to understanding that the chemistry in the whole thing is it's okay. It's not something
Mm,
that will uh get us. But one question I do want to ask one of these days, if I can get someone in the new protein side, is if there is cultured meat in a lab,
yeah.
what about the natural immunities and the resistances that come by? I think this applies to what organic farming is about as well,
It's a
because
very interesting question. Yeah. So,
yeah,
I mean, my business
where
partner and
does
I
the
also
immunity
have a
come from, right?
alternative protein. Yeah, we also have an alternative protein company, and I've done some work on it. And I think
Mm,
it's a very interesting conversation to have when it comes to what's going into the product and
mm,
what is the upside for the consumer, right? So I think that's always a central question. And the natural immunity and all things like that. It's always a matter of functionality as well.